Let me first thank Stacy Miller for sharing this wonderful collection of hats with the Aurora University community. If nothing else, my talk today is a nice opportunity to tour this exhibit, or at least some of the objects in it. And I hope that many of you will make arrangements to come and see it in person in the weeks ahead. Today, I want to approach these hats from the perspective of religious studies. And I want to think about the ways in which looking at headwear, looking at religious objects made by people, enjoyed by people, and employed by people for the fashioning of their self-identity, their cultural belonging, and their spiritual power. I want to think about how that changes or perhaps broadens the way that we typically think about religion in contemporary society. Every year, every semester, when I start my religion classes, I ask students to tell me a little bit about what they think religion is. I ask them to define religion on day one. And I typically get responses that include keywords such as church, morals, rules, boring, old, right? These words conjure up a series of associations, and they are hints at some underlying assumptions about religion that I'll touch on in this talk. So I try to present to students, and some of you, if some of my students are in the audience, this might sound a bit familiar. I try to present my 4 principles for understanding religion or for thinking differently about religion. First, religious beliefs, and by far beliefs are what my students associate with religion. Religious beliefs need people to believe them. And religion, too, is more than just belief. 3, the past lives in religions. And 4, religions change, they adapt, they evolve. People's behaviors, their attitudes, and their experiences change over time. And I hope that my talk today will illustrate some of these things and also elaborate a little bit on why I think we need to shift our understanding of religion and how hats in this collection and others like them can help us do it. So on the right here, you see the Shanag black hat from Bhutan. This is coming out of Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And on the left, you can see an image of a contemporary performance of the black hat dance in Bhutan. This image is from 2013. The dance commemorates the killing of the supposedly anti-Buddhist emperor Langdarma by a monk. And so it's this kind of lively celebration of the victory of good over evil, the victory of the religious over the irreligious. And it's has vibes of nationalism, of independence, of sovereignty. Here's a bit of a close-up of some of the dancers in this performance, and once again the hat from Stacy Miller's collection. This ritual brings religion to life, and the hat, of which we have an example in the exhibit, is a fantastic, I mean, it's, as you can see, it's beautiful. It's the craftsmanship, the materials, it's just really striking. And it's unlike anything in our day-to-day 21st century American experience of religion for the vast majority of us. We don't wear hats like these to celebrate Easter, Christmas, Hanukkah. We don't encounter hats like this in a lot of cultural celebrations. And one of the things, of course, that going to a museum and experiencing the objects there gives us a chance to do is experience cultural difference, to educate ourselves about just the range of cultural diversity that's out there. And it's a fantastic opportunity to do so. But sometimes I think that when we see something like this that's so distinct from our daily experience, we have a tendency to exoticize it, to sort of assume that its function is something that's perhaps outdated, perhaps purely ornamental, to sort of lose sight of how embedded in people's ideas about the world this object might actually have been or might continue to be. In what ways does this ritual bring the past alive, right? Seeing this ceremony for those who witness it is a chance to travel back to the 9th century. It's a chance to relive, to make present in the current world something that is a part of a national tradition, a religious tradition. And that commemorative function is more than just history. And it's more than just a dance, right? It is a bringing to life in the present. It is a kindling of the presence of spiritual and historical others. And that sort of connection with the past, with things that are invisible, with things that are outside of the realm of the really real in the tangible sense. This is one of the things that's distinctive about what religious practices can do. It's something that religious traditions bring to the cultural table that requires understanding not just history, not just aesthetics, but also something about the anthropology and the psychology of religious experience. Now, I'm guided in this understanding by a book which I'll quote for you a little bit later, but it helped me develop the title for this talk. It's a book by a Stanford anthropologist named Tanya Luhrmann called How God Becomes Real. Some of my students are working through this book with me right now this semester. And what Luhrmann argues in this book is that religious practice comes first. What happens, she asks, if we don't assume that people practice because they believe, but we ask whether they believe because they practice? Here are a couple of other hats in the collection that are associated with Buddhist tradition. One, a Lama ceremonial hat created in Tibet. The other, a 5 Buddha crown from Mongolia, both early 20th century. And in the crown on the lower right, you can see images of different Buddhas. Now, one of the things that we might ask ourselves when we look at this hat is, okay, it's clearly meant to be a statement of identity. It's clearly meant to be connecting the wearer, connecting the viewer to the religious past. Okay, in what way, right? In what way is this connecting viewers to the past? And in which way is this making something present, perhaps? I want to share a passage with you from a classic Buddhist text, one of the most popular scriptures in East Asian Buddhist tradition, the Lotus Sutra. If there are persons who, for the sake of the Buddha, fashion and set up images, carving them with many distinguishing characteristics, then all have attained the Buddha way. Or if they make things out of the 7 kinds of gems, of copper, red or white copper, pewter, lead, tin, iron, wood, or clay, or use cloth soaked in lacquer or resin to adorn and fashion Buddha images, then persons such as these have all attained the Buddha way. Even if little boys in play should use a piece of grass or wood or a brush or perhaps a fingernail to draw an image of the Buddha, such persons as these, bit by bit, will pile up merit and will become fully endowed with a mind of great compassion. They all have attained the Buddha way. So when we think about the way that these hats might kindle religious experience, might symbolize power, might communicate the status of the wearer, the religious authority of the wearer, we have to think about the fact that this is for Buddhists who take that text seriously, for practitioners in that tradition. The Lotus Sutra suggests that actually seeing, doing, experiencing these things is more than merely symbolic. It is actually something which gains you religious merit, something that makes you better, something that connects past and present, something that connects you to the world of spirits, something that actually transforms you. So to see one of these images, to be a part of a ceremony where these are worn, is more than merely viewership. It's a kind of participation. Now, one of my favorite scholars of religion is a scholar named S. Brent Plate, who wrote a book a number of years ago called A History of Religion in 5.5 Objects, Bringing the Spiritual to Its Senses. And I like to share this quote with you because it's very counterintuitive for us about what religion is all about. He writes, "Religious people are not believers so much as technologists. Ultimately, it is physical objects like stones, incense, drums, crosses, and bread that give rise to our religious language and make sacred utterances meaningful." And he adds, "We see, hear, smell, taste, and touch well before we speak." In other words, religion is not about beliefs in your head, but it is about, in short, bodies and stuff, the interaction of us and our environment, the things that we make, the things that we see, the things that we touch, the things that we engage in our spaces. Beliefs, to go back to the quote I offered from Luhrmann earlier, may in fact be kindled by the stuff, the spaces, the practices in which we do religion. Why is this controversial though? Why should it be that we tend to think about religion in the North American and European worlds as primarily about belief? Well, there's a history behind this. And I draw here on the work of Northwestern University historian Robert Orsi, who wrote a book a couple of years ago called History and Presence. And he said, beginning in early modernity, that is in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, as a dispute among Christians, divergent conceptions of presence became a point of absolute division between Catholics and Protestants. And then it evolved into one of the normative categories of modernity. This was the work over time of missionaries, lawyers, explorers, colonial administrators, armies and navies, poets, theologians, and finally, scholars. In other words, back in the 1500s, when divisions within Christianity, within European Christianity, broke open, in large part due to the influence of a certain German monk named Martin Luther, a difference of belief, a difference of practice, a difference of identity that erupted within European Christianity gave definitive shape to the way that religion from Europe spread around the world and the way those Europeans who explored, traded, colonized, conquered, and converted, the ways that they understood their own religion and the religions and cultures and practices of those that they met in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Why Luther? What was it that was going on in 16th century Europe that started all of this? Well, if I may boil it down to a single quote, Martin Luther, when asked to defend his interpretation of Scripture, his criticisms of Roman Catholic tradition, and his critique of the power of the Pope, he wrote in 1521 at the Diet of Worms, "Your Imperial Majesty and your Lordship demand a simple answer. Here it is, plain and unvarnished. I stand convinced by the Scriptures to which I have appealed, and my conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, for to act against conscience is neither safe nor right. Here I stand, I can do no other. God help me. Amen." a moment in perhaps the history of the emergence of the modern individual conscience supreme against the authority of books, traditions, institutions, churches, right? What you believe, your reading of Scripture, Luther's reading of Scripture and tradition was sovereign for him. He was captive to the Word of God. And that emphasis on book, on word, on conscience, on belief, changed the tone of the conversation, changed European politics, and had a major impact on the spread of Christianity around the world, competition between Christians, and ultimately on the modern understanding of religion that we've inherited. This is an engraving from a French book from 1561 that gives us a sense of a little bit of the movement from a sense of one kind of sense of presence to a different kind of presence. This is a polemical pamphlet, something designed to inflame the opinions of Protestants, to get Reformed Christians to protest against the authority of the French king and the French Catholic Church. And the images and poems juxtaposed place, on the one hand, the true, pure, spiritual, biblical supper of the Protestants versus the idolatrous and putrid mass of the Catholics. The Catholics have their sacrifice, the Protestants have their symbolism. The Catholics have their ritual, the Protestants have their faith. It was, in other words, competition between rival Christian churches that gave shape to the idea that the stuff of religion was less than, right? The practices were less than. For Protestant Christians, for Lutherans, for Calvinists, this became a way of articulating why their version of Christianity was right and others were wrong. So when these Christians exported Christianity, they also exported religion, right? A definition of religion which valued belief, and while it was perfectly happy to catalog the practices, the images, the objects, indeed the hats of the religions of the world, from India to Africa to the Americas and back, nevertheless, the emphasis for Europeans was on belief. And this has shaped the way that religions have been exported. This is a hat from our collection, our exhibit, that is a bishop's mitre, a Catholic bishop's mitre, created in Vietnam in the late 20th century, a country that until the early 1600s was quite unfamiliar with Christian tradition. But through the missionary efforts of Italian, Portuguese, and French Jesuits, Catholic priests who were members of the Society of Jesus, Catholicism eventually became a very vibrant and increasingly indigenized religion in Southeast Asia. And when Indochina, the area that includes countries today, Cambodia, Vietnam, when that became a French colony, the influence of Catholic missionaries, France being a strongly Catholic nation, the influence of Catholic missionaries only increased to where today it's in fact Vietnam that exports Catholic priests to France, if you can believe it. All right, now how do we take this understanding of the history behind the idea of religion that we tend to bring to the table? How do we come back to these objects from Stacy Miller's collection, which represent a whole range of cultural and spiritual traditions? How do we look at these with new eyes? Well, on the left here, you have a headdress from what's today the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this headdress is something that is meant to, it's used in the practice of divining. It's worn by both male and female followers of Bilumbu divination, It's a ritual of the Luba tribe for telling the future through supernatural means. Diviners enter a trance, offering themselves as mediums for ancestors or spirits to speak through them to onlookers. And the wearer of this hat isn't just symbolizing the presence of a spirit. The wearer of this hat is embodying the spirit. We think we hear the word possession, we hear spirit possession, and our assumptions about this are quite often shaped by Hollywood films. We might think of The Exorcist or other popular examples of the horror genre and the way that those have appropriated mostly Christian ideas about spirit possession, about demonic possession. But the line between good and evil spirits runs differently through the cultural traditions of the Congo or Nigeria. It runs differently through these traditions than it does through Christianity. And the assumption of a single deity in the sky, present spiritually, but not in a bodily way, that Protestant Christianity has bequeathed to the study of religion, to the study of anthropology, to the collecting of such objects for museums, that's not the way that practitioners in African religions tend to think about possession. So the Yoruban beaded crown that we see on the lower right coming out of Nigeria, this is meant to not just symbolize the power of the king, but to connect the king who wears it, connect the leader who wears it with the spirits of ancestors, right? To bring those spirits into his body, to make those spirits present, to collapse past and now, and to create a community of the living and the dead in a way that isn't captured by the kind of talk of belief or symbolism that we might tend to bring to this. Religions bridge past and present, I've suggested. And I wanted to show this object from the collection. It's a late 20th century manufacture of a Shinto priest's hat, a kanmuri, a kind of hat that is supposed to date back all the way to the 7th or 8th century to the courtiers of the Heian period. And this image on the lower right of a small sculpture from the collection of the Metropolitan Museum in New York illustrates just how far back indeed this particular aesthetic tradition goes. So when a 20th or 21st century Shinto priest dons this hat to participate in a ritual at a shrine, to a kami, to one of the Japanese spirits, right? That priest is connecting himself, connecting the viewers gathered with traditions that date back centuries. And in that sense is refashioning those traditions, is using history to make identity, to make community in the present. Now, one example from the collection, which I love, which sort of cuts against the story that I've told of exporting religion and the kind of the dominance of Christianity in all of the places that it landed in the early modern and modern period in European imperialism, is this Huichol shaman's hat. It's fashioned in Mexico in the mid-20th century. And this is a nice, vivid example of a set of traditions which have been kept alive in spite of a Christianized and Christianizing trend in the history of Mexico. Of course, anyone who's familiar with Latin American history probably knows that the Spanish conquerors brought with them Catholicism to what's today Mexico in the 16th century. And the history of Catholicism in Mexico is quite complicated, but the relationship between church and state was quite close well into the 20th century. And the influence of Catholic priests and parishes up and down the villages and communities and cities of Mexico was incredibly strong, educating generations, teaching literacy, and bringing indeed a wide variety of indigenous peoples speaking a number of different languages and practicing historically a number of different traditions into a single national cultural identity. But not all of those indigenous groups lost their traditions. In fact, many have hung on quite tightly to them. And one, I mentioned that the relationship between church and state weakened in the 20th century. In the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution in the 19-teens and 20s, laws were passed which took property from the Catholic Church, and much of it was sold off. Some was held by the state, and there were a number of other changes which, in some ways, weakened the role of Catholicism in Mexican culture in some ways, certainly not in all ways. But one of the things that happened, and here, if you're familiar with the art of someone like Diego Rivera, some of the nationalist muralists of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, in celebrating the Mexican Revolution, in celebrating Mexico's identity and past, they brought back, they celebrated Mexico's indigenous traditions in many ways. And so these indigenous traditions no longer quite as actively suppressed by a Catholic Church, which was fighting for its own legal privileges and financial survival, made more cultural space for older practices which had once been suppressed as idolatrous, right? As making present dangerous or demonic spirits, as making real for people spirits other than the Christian God. Many of these practices have been able to come back, both as a celebration of local language and practice and identity, and also, honestly, as a way of connecting that with a burgeoning tourist industry, right? People coming to Mexico from around the world who are interested in learning about and experiencing this past. So something which may not have been continuously practiced in quite the same way for 5 centuries is, in the last 100 years, having more opportunities to reach people and to kind of rebuild a kind of indigenous core of Mexican culture in many areas of the country. So I've suggested that hats and the rituals of which they are a part transform people. So here's 2 objects from the collection which take us into the realm of rites of passage, rituals which are meant to change the person who undergoes them, to bring the person from one status to another, to give the person a new identity in the community. So on the upper part of the slide, we have a ceremonial hat from Turkey from the early 20th century. This is a hat that would have been used in a Bedi Bismillah ceremony, a celebration of the beginning of schooling. Now, there are both, from what I've read, there are both religious and secular versions of this ceremony. So in the early 20th century and before, this was a ceremony which pertained explicitly to the beginning of Quranic studies. But what I found when I went looking for contemporary examples of the ceremony, contemporary usages of hats like this, the term Bedi Besmele still sticks around, but it remains a part of Turkish culture in interesting ways, sort of secularized, something which has religious roots and retains a religious function, but a term and a set of celebrations which are now used to initiate not only boys but also girls into education, into, you know, it's a kind of entrance into the part of youth in which people are being introduced to all that school has to offer. So this is one example of a rite of passage. Another example of a rite of passage is, of course, the wedding. And this wedding crown on the lower half of the slide, made in Sumatra in Indonesia in the early 20th century, is if you visit the exhibition, it's front and center. It's incredibly striking in person. The image absolutely doesn't do it justice. Just the delicacy of the craftsmanship and the beauty of the materials. And obviously these two examples present something of a contrast. One which is made of more everyday materials, the other which obviously is meant to communicate a great deal of wealth. The status of the wearer of that wedding crown would no doubt be substantial. I mean, to have something like this would require significant financial investment. Rites of passage run the gamut. Rites of passage involve a whole range of rituals that different people go through at different ages. But the thing that unites them, the things that makes them rites of passage, is that the person who goes through it comes out different. The anthropologist Victor Turner once spoke of this being a passage through a liminal state, a state of liminality. And in that state of liminality, the person engaged in the ritual is unmoored, and they come out the other side of the ritual with a new status, a new role in society, whether that's somebody coming of age or whether that's somebody emerging as part of a married couple. Right? These rites of passage are one way in which doing religion, right, makes something happen. It doesn't merely indicate a belief in something intangible, but it makes tangible, it makes visible, it makes socially available a transformation. I've paired these two hats from the collection. A woman's skull cap from Afghanistan, made in the mid-20th century, and a Sufi hat from Iran in the late 20th century. Two examples of Islamic head coverings. Oops. Now, one thing that my students tend to associate with religion is a sense of rules, of obligations. And they tend to think of, we tend to think of religious obligations as being something that someone either has imposed on them by society, by institutions, by authorities, or something that someone takes on themselves. But in Christian tradition, again, Christian traditions and the Protestant infused idea of religion, which Europe exported and which Europe brought to cultural encounters with religions such as Buddhism and Islam, as well as indigenous practices all over the world. That sense of religion, shaped by Martin Luther's view of the Bible as the only true grounding for religious truth, the only source on which European Christians were to base their version of, for example, the celebration of Holy Communion. We already saw the conflict that generated in 16th century Europe, and one of the ways in which that idea still shapes the way that we approach objects like this is that when we see a hat like this, we ask ourselves, is this a cultural expression, or is this a religious obligation? Right? Surely a multi-regional transnational religion like Islam is going to experience variation. Right? There's going to be different ways in which people practice this religion in different times and places. And when we encounter objects like this, we might ask ourselves, where is the line between culture and religion? And what I'm suggesting in this talk, by digging up this early modern history and highlighting for us the way that it shapes our viewing of these objects, is to try to break down that distinction. I want us to think about this not as a question of where such an obligation might be grounded, but rather that religion and culture are more intricately intertwined, and that the ways in which people make religion real, the ways in which people make transformations in themselves by putting on clothing, the way that they might clothe themselves with an identity, transform themselves by wearing a new hat symbolizing a new status, the ways in which all of these things happen when we wear an object like a piece of headwear. It transcends this artificial boundary between religion and culture. And if an object like this makes religious identity felt, if it makes it real, if it brings it into the present for the practitioner, we maybe shouldn't ask a question that if you start to Google around the question of headwear in Islam, of course you encounter a lot of stories and articles from the last several decades related especially to obligations in certain Muslim societies for women to cover their heads, or indeed to cover their whole bodies, or to in other ways perform modesty. And the scholar of religion infused with this sort of early modern Protestant mindset might ask themselves, well, Christians base their beliefs on and practices on the Bible. So for Muslims, the sacred text is the Quran. So where's the Quranic passage that says, thou shalt wear a hat, or thou shalt cover thy hair? One searches in vain for these, because there is no Quranic passage, there is no passage in the Holy Book of Islam which obligates men or women to cover their heads in prayer. There are some attested traditions that suggest that the Prophet Muhammad and many of his earliest followers adopted the practice of covering their heads in modesty and wearing hats as a way of entering more deeply into an attitude, sort of centering themselves in a way that would render their religious practice, their prayer, more solemn, more acceptable to God. But to approach the question of clothing with the idea of what is optional, or what is a cultural preference or an individual preference, what is personalized versus what is obligatory, is to miss a tremendous amount of variation and to overlook something about the way that objects, I'm contending, make religion real. I've already told a story in which religious division, religious conflict is a part of things. And one example from the collection that illustrates this, that illustrates the way that clothing doesn't just communicate identity to a group of like-minded believer practitioners, but that also communicates something externally, that communicates something to others in society, is this embroidered hood from Yemen, fashioned in the mid-20th century. This is a hood which is primarily worn by members of the Jewish community in Yemen. And it has served over time to distinguish the Jewish communities of Yemen in the Middle East on the Arabian Peninsula. It served to distinguish the Jewish minority population from the Muslim majority population. And so Muslims wear different sorts of head coverings in this culture, whereas Jewish women might primarily employ variations on this design. This is the last hat from the collection that I want to share with you today. It's an example of the whirling dervish hat. And you can see here two images, one from the 18th century, an engraving by Bernard Picart, a Flemish engraver publisher, in his book, The Religious Ceremonies and Customs of All the People of the World. This was based on, not on his firsthand observation, but on testimony and on other engraved images and paintings that he had access to. But he was one of these early modern Protestants who became deeply learned about other religions in order to compare and contrast those practices. This shows us, again, the influence of European debates and ideas about religion on the kind of scholarship that observers, anthropologists, and sociologists of religion have done over the centuries. But it also shows us that this is not merely a creation of the modern world. The image on the upper part of the slide is a photograph of whirling dervish practitioners in 21st century Turkey. This is a tradition which stretches all the way back to the 13th century, to the community around the poet and mystic Rumi, who was someone who was trying to, in his practice of Islam, was trying to get deeper and deeper into the experience of the love of God. And this ritual of spinning around, of performing this dance to music that is both an aesthetic practice and a kind of meditation, a vehicle to religious experience, something that transports the performer to another interior state, right? It's an external practice, a bodily practice, something that is visible to others gathered, that nevertheless is a vehicle for an inner transformation. So it's a little bit different than a rite of passage, but the dervish practitioner is supposed to, through this practice, enter more deeply into the love of God. And if you want, you can find easily videos of this practice online, and you'll see that there are hand gestures which sort of show the practitioner unfurling slowly and then more rapidly as they whirl around, and gestures which indicate that the practitioner is trying to open up space in their insides for the love of God to flow in, to fill that space. As I wrap up here, I want to come back to Tanya Luhrmann, this anthropologist with whom I started our talk today. And again, she writes in her recent book, How God Becomes Real, I'm asking what we might learn if we shift our focus, if, rather than presuming that people worship because they believe, we ask instead whether people believe because they worship. As people practice, she contends, as the invisible other becomes more real to them, people remake themselves in relationship with that other. These relationships can be intensely intimate and drenched in feeling, something not quite captured by the word belief. So as I close, I want to thank you for sharing this journey through religious studies, through European and world history, and through the wonderful collection that's on display at the Shingothi Center right now. And I hope that I have changed your mind a little bit about the way in which religion kindles a presence, transforms individuals not merely in their belief, in their identity as symbolized by what they wear and what they do, but that the material practices, the embodied practices of religion are utterly inseparable from the experience. And that if we reduce religion to belief, we are apt to miss something and to miss some of the beauty and some of the power in these wonderful pieces of headwear. Thank you very much, and I look forward to some questions and conversation.
Thanks, John. We did have a couple questions for you. I think we'll start with this one. What is the most surprising thing that you discovered during your research for this presentation?
That is a great question. Honestly, so much of it was surprising. I mean, I think, the great thing about studying objects, about being able to see them in person is that it really does make vivid a whole cultural history that you might not normally have access to. And I guess what I'm always surprised by, if I think about the black hat that was the first one that I showed, let me just briefly call it back. So the Bhutanese shaman hat here. This hat and a little bit further on the shaman hat. Let me pull that one back up as well. This one here. What always surprises me as a historian who spent most of my career looking at and teaching from and researching books is that when you encounter objects like these, it just, the political and the social and the cultural history just explodes out there. When I've taught about the Mexican Revolution before, I've never really thought about how the changing legal relationship with the Catholic Church might contribute to a revival of interest in objects like this, so that more of them might be made and sold, and some of these spiritual practices that have been more or less underground might be both for the purposes of tourism and for the purposes of celebrating indigenous history and culture, might have a chance to come back to life in a way that, you know, might not have been thinkable 50 or 100 years earlier. So I think it's those connections between the history in books and the object before you that's the most memorable and striking part of doing work like this.
As a collections manager, I can relate. It's always interesting to actually see the object as opposed to just reading about it or just seeing it on a photograph in a book. Thank you. So then we have a couple more questions for you. How do you think material practices in mainstream world religions have changed in recent years?
That's a fantastic question. And the story that I've told is, I'm trying to break down dichotomies between, you know, culture and religion, between belief and practice, between presence and absence, between symbolism and sort of the feeling and transformation of the practitioner. But I may have fallen into a little bit too stark a binary myself, which is to say that that on the one hand, there's this European idea of what religion is. And on the other hand, there's this more organic sense of religion as being something whose presence in culture is kindled in different ways by different practices, but is not artificially severed from other domains of life, is not thought of as, for example, on the one hand, the secular, and on the other hand, the religious, in the way that, say, legal arrangements in places like France or England or the United States might kind of set up. The truth is that European export has had a lot of impact on the ways that religions are practiced in the 20th and 21st centuries. So I think one thing that's transforming the way that religion is practiced is to put it bluntly, kind of globalization. And I think that there is both a legal dimension to this, as other countries around the world adopt constitutions, school systems, and arrangements for managing internal religious diversity that kind of mirror the US Constitution or the French Constitution or the German Constitution. There's a way in which the place of religion in society in places like India or Ghana, to give two examples, is coming to resemble more frequently, especially in urban centers and in sort of places where culture and government meet. It's coming to resemble that Western conception increasingly. That's not to say that the more organic take on religion that I've tried to promote here is disappearing, but the assumption that religion is just one part of life and we keep it in this box over here is something that has spread and has taken root in diverse ways in other countries and cultures. And then the other way is money, right? Tourism, right? The desire of people in wealthier societies, people with money, to experience other cultures, right? To get a taste of something that's not part of their everyday experience means that there's a tremendous amount of financial interest in reviving, preserving, promoting, highlighting as distinctive some of these cultural practices. And I think that can't but change them, right? Something that's been around for centuries changes when you are now having a strong incentive to market it as a product that represents you. That has a way of potentially kind of fossilizing culture and fossilizing the past in a way that enables a certain kind of exchange, but maybe forecloses others.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. So then could these hats, could we compare these hats that you talked about today to European religious relics? And if so, or if not, how would they differ?
That's a great question. And so the scholar that I cited, Robert Orsi, who wrote that book, History and Presence, most of his research has been on Catholicism in the United States and the ways that European immigrant communities from Poland and Italy and other majority Catholic countries have kind of kept alive the old school Catholic idea of sacramental presence, not just in church on Sunday, but in other areas of their lives. And so things like relics that you might encounter in a church, things like holy cards, statues. I have behind me, and I have another one here. All over my office, I have religious trinkets of different sorts that I've acquired in different places. And, you know, for believers in practitioners in Catholic tradition, many of those objects, especially if they've been blessed by a priest or a bishop, they take on a kind of holiness, a kind of spiritual presence that is different from other sorts of everyday objects. So I think the comparison is wonderful. And that we could think more about the ways in which Catholic traditions that have continued the pre-modern practice of venerating the relics left behind by holy men and women. I think that absolutely is comparable to the way that I'm trying to talk about these hats as making something present and making it real in a different sort of way. I think that's a great question, and I would encourage the questioner to keep on following up on that.
All right, and then I think we just have time for one more question. So the last question: can you speak a little on how Eastern religious practices have impacted Western religious practices? And if maybe you could think of some specific examples of different types of hats even.
That's a great question. And I think that will need to be my next research project. Much of the thinking that I've done has been about the export rather than the import. And I think there is a lot to be learned about the ways in which that has, of course, been not only an encounter and an export, but an exchange. I think in the 20th century and into the 21st century, there have been a lot of ways in which aspects of Asian religions have, subtly or sometimes not so subtly transformed Western religious and spiritual practice. And one great example of this is just the explosion in mindfulness. Another might be the explosion of yoga in 20th and 21st century America. These things which have roots in Buddhist and Hindu traditions, but which are now things that are practiced by, a whole host of European, North American people all over the world, more or less severed from the textual roots, from some of the original meanings, adopted as forms of wellness practice or athletic activity by many, or as a kind of add-on to other sorts of worldviews for others. So there absolutely has been an increase in religious exchange over time. What's interesting is that there hasn't been, that's been mostly in the yoga as an example, mindfulness is an example of an embodied spiritual practice from the East, which has made its way west and is continuing to transform the ways that we think about these things. But it hasn't always brought its own aesthetic, right? The American yoga aesthetic is not the aesthetic of 16th century Northern India. And the devotionalism of Hatha yoga in that time and place is not the ways that even contemporary Americans who want to connect with those spirits through the practice, it's not exactly the same. So there's some complicated layers there.
Definitely. Okay. Well, thank you so much, John. I think that kind of wraps it up for today. Natasha?
And I just wanted to thank you as well. And I wanted to let you know that we just got a message from Stacy Miller, the curator and collector of this exhibition. And she wanted to thank you so much for all of your insights, and she really enjoyed your presentation. So,
well, thank you again, Stacy, and thank you, Natasha and Laura, for inviting me to participate in this. It's been a great pleasure.